Hey everybody, this is the third section from the book State Capitalism and World Revolution by C.L.R. James, written in collaboration with Raya, Dunayevskaya, and Boggs. I'm just reading these sections one at a time. I don't know if I'll put the order number or not. Just putting them up as individual pieces based on the chapter title. And the third chapter is titled Lenin and State Capitalism. Equally instructive as the Stalinist treatment of state capitalism and planning, here a little history is necessary. It was Marx in Capital Volume 1 who stated that the only limit to centralization was all the capital in a single country in the hands of a single corporation. If this is not the economic form of state capitalism, what is it? It was not a chance remark. He did not have it in the first edition. He wrote it into the second edition with some other points and asked all to note that the editions possessed a, quote, scientific value independent of the original, end quote. On this no word, not a word from Stalinists and not a word from Orthodox Trotskyism. In Anti-During, Engels writes the passage is so well known that we shall not quote them. They are so clear that there were members of the Workers' Party who discussed them with the cynicism that Engels was a, quote, Johnsonite, end quote. It was either this or saying that, quote, Johnson Forrest, end quote, were followers of Engels. They preferred the first. Marx, it is known, approved Engels' draft. In his criticism of the Erfurt program, Engels attacked the formulation that there was no plan in capitalism. He ends, quote, if we pass from joint companies to trusts which command and monopolize entire branches of industry, then we not only cease to have private production, but we cease to have planlessness, end quote. Karl Kautsky, while denying that capitalism can plan, never thought of denying statification. In 1907, Karl Kautsky wrote in explanation of the Erfurt program, quote, the final result must be the concentration of all the instruments of production in the hands of one person or one stock company to be used as private property and be disposed of at will. The whole machinery of production will be turned into a gigantic concern subject to a single master, end quote. The Class Struggle, Erfurt Program, Karl Kautsky. Lenin's treatment of the whole question is a model of Marxism. In Imperialism, published in 1915, Lenin writes only of monopoly capitalism. Then you can trace how stage by stage Lenin reaches state monopoly capitalism in the preface to State and Revolution of 1917. In spring of 1917, in Lenin's first report in Russia on the political situation, Lenin described how during the war capitalism had developed even more than before the war. Then, quote, as early as in 1891, i.e. 27 years ago, Engels maintained that capitalism could not be regarded any longer as being planless. This idea has become obsolete. Once there are trusts, planlessness disappears. Monopoly in general has evolved into state monopoly, end quote. Lenin, Collected Works, The Revolution of 1917, Book 1, 282. Then comes a paragraph in which Lenin separates himself from the whole underlying political economy of the Fourth International. Quote, general conditions show that the war has accelerated the development of capitalism. It advanced from capitalism to imperialism, from monopoly to nationalization. All this made the socialist revolution closer and created the objective conditions for it. Thus, the course of the war has brought the socialist revolution nearer to us, end quote. Although Kautsky, for example, had a different theory from Lenin on state capitalism, all Marxists until the Fourth International agreed on this, that the concentration of capital, however great, did not lessen but increase the crisis of capitalism. It is in the theory of the degenerated workers' state that our whole movement has learned to see in a completely centralized capital regeneration, progress for capitalism. In the reply to the debate, Lenin quoted from the resolution on which Lenin was speaking, quote, monopoly capitalism is changing into state monopoly capitalism. Social regulation of production and distribution is under the pressure of circumstances being introduced into many countries, end quote. Lenin says again, quote, it is noteworthy that 27 years ago, Engels pointed out that to characterize capitalism as something distinguished by capitalism's planlessness means to overlook the role played by trust and is unsatisfactory, ... This remark of Engels is particularly appropriate now when we have state monopoly capitalism. The introduction of planning into industry keeps the workers enslaved nonetheless, though planning enables the capitalists to gather in their profits in a more planful way. We now witness the metamorphosis of capitalism into a regulated form of capitalism. End quote. Lenin. 1 second, where's my coffee at? Gotta have my coffee. And here must be noted a remarkable thing. Obviously, that resolution on which Lenin was speaking would be a very important document. The Stalinist archivists say that no copy can be found, be that as it may, as we have shown in the Invading Socialist Society, another piece put out by the Johnson Forest Tendency. The whole strategy of the October Revolution was built on this. In State and Revolution, Lenin says that the trusts cannot, of course, plan production completely, but however much they do plan, they cannot avoid the contradictions of capitalism. Not mere nationalization, even, quote, confiscation, end quote, Lenin repeated and repeated, means military penal labor for the workers. You must have workers' control of production under a Soviet state. The theoreticians of Stalinism avoid all this like the plague. Then in 1918, Lenin throws his whole weight against the left communists, basing himself on this theory. Quote, to elucidate the question still more, let us first of all take the most concrete example of state capitalism. Everybody knows what this example is. It is Germany. Here we have, quote, the last word, end quote, in modern large-scale capitalist technique and planned organization subordinated to Junker bourgeois imperialism. Cross out the words in italics, Junker bourgeois imperialism, and in place of the militarist Junker bourgeois imperialist state, put a state, but of a different type, of a different class, content, a Soviet, that is a proletarian state, and you will have the sum total of the conditions necessary for socialism, end quote, Lenin. Lenin says again, quote, at present petty bourgeois capitalism prevails in Russia and is one and the same, and it is one and the same road that leads from petty bourgeois capitalism to large-scale capitalism and to socialism through one and the same intermediary station called, quote, national accounting and control of production and distribution, end quote. Those who fail to understand this are committing an unpardonable mistake in economics, end quote. Lenin. And once again, Lenin refers to his previous work on the question of state capitalism, quote, in order to convince the reader that this is not the first time I have given this, quote, high, end quote, appreciation of state capitalism, and that I gave it before the Bolsheviks seized power, I take the liberty of quoting the following passage from my pamphlet, The Threatening Catastrophe and How to Fight It, written in September 1917, end quote, Lenin. When Lenin introduced the new economic policy, Lenin quoted this passage to the extent of 3 pages. Lenin did not know German fascism or the United States economy during the war, but this whole method shows that in his usual... No, thank you. But in his usual manner, always watching the stages, he would have had not the slightest difficulty with fascist Germany and Yugoslavia or contemporary Poland. There's nothing, absolutely nothing, in the past of Marxism to prevent a Marxist from saying that in its death agony, capitalism, though in its classic form an economy of private property, can reach a stage where the capitalist class can plan the economy as a whole. This would have been a great triumph for our movement, so well laid were the foundations and the method in the past, but our ancestors could say this because Marx, Engels, Lenin, Bukharin took it as a corollary that centralization meant the intensification of the crisis for such a capitalism. But up to 1919, this was not the issue. Bukharin's theory of state capitalism is not ours and was criticized even in his own day, but he elaborated it in the ABC of Communism. The book was highly praised by Lenin and was sold in millions of copies in several languages as an official party textbook. Why? Because he wrote that even if anarchy of individual capitalism was abrogated by state capitalism, collapse was still inevitable. Had he written the opposite, the denunciations would have started with Lenin. That was Bolshevism, and that was how Trotsky wrote in the first manifesto of the Communist International, quote, the state control of social life against which capitalist liberalism so strives is to become a reality. There is no turning back either to free competition or to the domination of trust syndicates and other kinds of social anomalies. The question consists solely in this: who shall control state production in the future, the imperialist state or the state of the victorious proletariat? End quote. Lenin. To this 1919 analysis of end quote, Trotsky. To this 1919 analysis of Trotsky's, Johnson Forrest still subscribe wholeheartedly. New section, Pablo and State Capitalism. I have a piece by a brief in the biographical piece on Michel Pablo, who was the leader of the Fourth International for a long time, and was the head of the International Secretariat after the split in, I believe, in the early 1950s. I can't say the exact year because I'm rusty, but anyway, it is obvious, and this is only a small selection of the material, that the whole past of our movement made it difficult to escape the theoretical possibility that Russia might be a form of state capitalism. The Stalinist theoreticians knew all this. There had been restlessness in Russia over it. No such restlessness stirred the majority of Trotskyists, secure in the belief that the nationalized property rendered all such considerations useless. But once Pablo decided on the road he was following, he recognized state capitalism as the enemy. He warns against it repeatedly, warns Germain that that is where he will end, and undertakes at last to explain it. Pablo explains that when Engels wrote about state capitalism, Engels was, quote, like Trotsky, referring to the tendency, end quote. This is a positive crime. Trotsky and Engels were here at opposite poles. Trotsky writes, quote, state capitalism means the substitution of state property for private property, and for that very reason remains partial in character, end quote. Engels writes, quote, taking over the great institutions for production and communication, first by joint stock companies, later on by trust, then by the state, end quote. Footnote. Engels writes this in a supplement to the chapters from Anti-Düring, which he reprinted in Socialism, Scientific, and Utopian. No one so far, not even the Stalinists so far as we know, has ever denied that the original statements in Anti-Düring theoretically take the question to complete state ownership. End footnote. What did Pablo expect Engels to write? Quote, taking over the great institutions of production, each and every single one, by which I mean omitting none, etc., end quote, question mark. Pablo continues, quote, Engels in that day little suspected the enormous concentration of monopoly capitalism which followed his epoch, end quote. Engels spoke continually of trust, trust, trust. Lenin and others constantly referred to Engels' analysis of trust, trust, trust. In the quotations already cited, Engels says, quote, trusts which command and monopolize entire branches of industry, end quote. Pablo flips the great achievements of Marxism into the dustbin. What fanaticism is this? Quote, Johnson Forrest, end quote, have met it before in the Shachtmanites. When faced with questions like these, their attitude always was, tear down the skies, root up the foundations, let everything go to ruin rather than accept the simple fact. No rearrangement of capital on capital side of the barricades, actual or to the farthest degree of theoretical possibility, can solve the contradictions of capitalism which remain the exclusive task of the revolutionary proletariat. Who opposes Pablo? All we have seen so far is some Shachtman-esque leaps and jumps by Germain, who is Ernest Mandel. In the invading socialist society, we quoted Lenin and prodded Germain. No answer. Now suddenly, life having destroyed his theory, characteristically Trotskyist, that only the masses could nationalize property in Eastern Europe, and under pressure by Pablo, Germain announces in portentous language in big print, quote, we are confronted by transitional cases of combined development, in which the property relations can be overturned without the economy thereby automatically becoming an economy orienting away from capitalism towards socialism, and without permitting us to conclude that what we have is a workers' state. End quote. The Yugoslav question, the question of the buffer zone and their implication for Marxist theory. Germain. Quote, in these transitional situations, the law of combined development can present cases in which the statification of the greatest part of the means of production and exchange can be the work of a non-workers' state. In such situations, this statification then ceases to be an automatic criterion proving the existence of a workers' state, end quote. Germain. This is the theory of exceptionalism so devastated by Trotsky, transferred to the whole world. In passing, it gives the same treatment to the economic basis of the Trotskyist theory of state property that Pablo gives to Engels, throws it on the dust heap. Who accepts this? Who does not accept this? We do not know. If this is not chaos, we are willing to use any other word which is suggested to us. Final section. Varga and state capitalism. Eugene Varga. Maybe it's Evgeny, I don't know. But it's Varga, the Soviet economist. No such confusion is tolerated near the Stalinists. For a brief period when it seemed they were uncertain of their relation with Western Europe, they themselves called the states in Eastern Europe state capitalism. Even they recognized that they were either worker states or state capitalism, even they. Then when the line turned, they went straight back to Leontiev in 1943. This is what is falsely known as the Varga controversy around Varga's book, Changes in the Political Economy of Capitalism, resulting from the Second World War. It was not Varga alone. It was practically the whole staff of the Institute of World Economics which Varga headed. Faced with the fact that capitalism had not collapsed, Varga was the mouthpiece of the Institute which could find a reason for the continued existence of capitalism only in the fact that capitalism moved to state capitalism which could plan. Varga was more careful than Pablo because Varga at least said that this equilibrium would last for a decade and not for centuries. His economic theory was also superior to Pablo's, for at the same time, along with his underconsumptionism, Varga, the mouthpiece, very cautiously reintroduced the theory of the falling rate of profit, holding to it, so to speak, in reserve against his previous underconsumptionism. Despite the caution, these statements by Varga showed that the Stalinists know very well how to analyze state capitalism and the falling rate of profit. When the turn came, the reaction was brutal. In the course of the discussion on Varga's book, one bold woman, Maria Natovna Smith, attacked Varga from the left. Quote, "The book," end quote, she began, quote, "lacks an analysis of the great new change connected with the transition from simple money capitalism to simple monopoly capitalism to state monopoly capitalism, as Lenin understood this transition," end quote. Maria Natovna Smith then proceeds to quote Lenin, quote, "During the war, world capitalism took a few steps forward, not only toward concentration in general, but also toward state capitalism in even a greater degree than formerly," end quote. Smith concluded, quote, "Where Lenin unites the concept of, quote, state, end quote, and of monopoly, Comrade Varga seems to separate them. Each exists by itself, and meanwhile, in fact, the process of coalescence of the state with monopoly manifests itself quite sharply at the present time in such countries as the USA and England," end quote. Smith. Maria Natovna Smith. It was an attempt to start where Lenin had left off and by his method to deal with the vast experience of 30 years. Smith was stamped down at once. Quote, "Imperialism is what Lenin elucidates. This is the stage of decay and death of capitalism beyond which no new phase of capitalism follows, ... I think one should agree with Comrade Varga, who does not seek such a phase and does not try to establish a transition to such a phase," end quote. Footnote. The stenographic transcript of the entire discussion was published in English by Public Affairs Press, Washington, D.C. I don't know who that quote is from. It's a response to Maria Natovna Smith to Varga. It's a response to Maria Natovna Smith, but I'm not sure if it's by Varga or not, or who it's from. Anyway, back to the text. In this, quote, "new phase," end quote, would be what? Nothing else but state capitalism. They know that Lenin's whole method prepared for this and nothing else but this. Varga, in his turn, said that Smith, quote, "tried to advance a new theoretical idea," end quote, and that, quote, "the question is one of terminology and not one of substance," end quote. Leninism, and with it the theory of state capitalism, was buried once more. The outline is necessarily summary. It is not the fault of, quote, Johnson Forrest, end quote, if we have, In 1950, it's not the fault of Johnson Forrest if we have in 1950 to spend so much space and time on what should be elementary questions in this discussion. But if we do not do it, who else will? We've said enough to show how profoundly state capitalism and everything connected with state capitalism is embedded in the past and is today in the center of the arena and of the crises in Stalinist political economy. And the Fourth International? A blank, a complete and comprehensive blank. Worse, every word it writes fortifies Stalinism. The end of Chapter 3 of State Capitalism and World Revolution by C.L.R. James, written in collaboration with Raya, Dunayevskaya, and Grace Lee Boggs. The end. The chapter is titled Lenin and State Capitalism.